Said Big Brother. No, I'm just kidding. Okay. 1 second here. Screen share. Desktop. Okay. So sociological imagination. What is the sociological imagination? Really, this is a perspective. This is a way sociologists want to try, right? And even like try to get across to people who are studying sociology that this is how we try to look at the world. And before I talk about C. Wright Mills' specific definition here, it's really a perspective of compassion and non-judgmental understanding. And that is when somebody makes a claim or when somebody says something or somebody talks about some social issue, some argument, anything, the sociologist who applies the sociological imagination reserves judgment until they look at these qualities that Mills talks about. So Mills talks about these qualities that are important in applying the sociological imagination. That the person needs to grasp the history, the biography, and the relations between the two within society. So when we're looking at why somebody does what they do in a society, the first thing a sociologist wants to do is to look at the history. What historical ideas, what historical institutions, what history of beliefs have led to the construction of this person to then influence why they do what they do in this society. That's the first one. So that's something called public issues, right? So these kind of social histories that exist that penetrate the individual that then lead to why the individual does what they do. The second part is the biography. And those are like the personal experiences of that individual specifically, not the historical public things that most people in that society experience, ideas, beliefs, but it's the actual personal experience that that person's had. So let's say a person has a really controversial view on gay marriage, for example, right? The sociological imagination, the person without the sociological imagination would basically tell them they're an idiot and refuse to, hear them out or whatever, immediately judge them, right? Person with sociological imagination says, well, why do they hate gay marriage? And then we go back and we look at their history. Well, they grew up in this society, which was, let's say was predominantly Christian, like fundamentalist Christian or fundamentalist Islam, which we know are not, the most generous societies towards gay marriage in general, right? So then we look at that history, and then we also look at their personalized experiences, right? Like they grew up in this household with parents who were also devout Christians, right? So not only were they in the society, but then they had the experiences. And so they developed this raw hate for gay marriage. So it doesn't mean that we have to agree with them as sociologists, but it does mean that now we've seen their biography, right? We've seen the personal lifestyle and experiences that have led to part of their view. And we've also grasped the history that forms the context of why they believe what they believe. Controversial, right? The sociological imagination is that perspective. Does anyone have any questions before I move on here? Okay. Sweet. Sex and gender. How much time we got here? Sweet, 6 minutes. Basically, when we're thinking about sex from the sociological perspective, we're taking the biological understanding as well and saying that when thinking about sex, we're thinking about the genome that actually is on the chromosomes of the human individuals that determines phenotypical characteristics and other physical characteristics of those sex chromosomes. So when we're talking about biological sex, we're talking about, the XX chromosome and XY chromosome for the male and the XX chromosome for the female, and that a result of having those chromosomes, right, in a high percentage is going to lead to certain physical characteristics that are going to evolve later as what are called phenotypes. So the genotype is the actual gene that codes for things on things that a human body has. So I have a genotype for my nose, and the phenotype is the actual way the nose looks, right? And so that's what we're thinking about sex. We're thinking about that. So we're thinking about natural production of certain hormones that are a result of chromosomal XY chromosome assignment, and also just physical things like genitalia and stuff like that, right? So that's what we're talking about with sex. Sex is biology. It's not socially produced, right, for the sociologist. Gender, on the other hand, is different, right? So gender is this spectrum of performed behaviors that we generally attribute to having masculine or feminine characteristics, or both in between. And now that's kind of an older definition of what gender is. I just wanted to give us a general understanding when we're talking about gender. We're talking about these are behaviors people do, right, that are reinforced by society, heavily pressured. So when we talk in some societies, so when we talked earlier, Ella gave us those great examples from her culture, and then we saw that sometimes gender is imposed and pressured in different ways. I have the opinion that pressures of gender on the human subject can be good and bad. I've seen in my research in MMA and mixed martial arts that pressures of masculinity can be good, and they can also be bad in both circumstances. And femininity in the exact same way. Actually, there's a really good book called The Beauty Myth, which is basically the imposition of the ideal of beauty on women since kind of the beginning of recorded history that has led to a lot of pressure on women to live up to the sense of beautiful. So basically what we expect of men and women in different social situations. These are very basic definitions, but I just wanted to go over them to give everyone an understanding and a clear distinction between what we mean between sex and gender. How much time do we have here? Oh, we got 3 minutes. And so I just had this quick, by the way, this is Ali hitting Fraser here. I'm a boxer, so I had to use a boxing analogy. But it's very interesting to think about the why sociologists present sex and gender the way they do and why biologists do. So now you're seeing Thomas as the philosopher. Now I'm stepping back from these systems of knowledge, of sociology that, you know, people think that I'm a sociologist, but I'm also a philosopher. So it's important to separate ourselves from epistemological systems or knowledge systems and see why these systems argue what they argue, right? And so for me, when I think about, you know, sociology underneath, right, in the essence of the sociologist is to help people, and sociologists generally see that the people on the margins are in the most need of help, right? And so this is a reasonable proposition, right? It's like, well, of course, like we want to, you know, now what we're going to do as sociologists when we're looking at sexuality and gender is look at the margins, because these are the people who are suffering the most. So you can see why the sociological perspective and where it comes from, and that it does come from a place, I mean, generally, I think of good, right? So, and the biological perspective of sex and gender comes from a different place. And so they have a different way of framing how we should actually discuss these things, right? They both make factual claims, right? That there's a male, female, but then there's a gender of sexualities, you know, and spectrum of genders in between. They both make factual claims, but one system of knowledge chooses to emphasize one over the other. And it's important that we think as philosophers and human beings, if we're able to separate ourselves from these knowledges, why that these are actually happening, and realize that they're being framed within relations, you know, of power as well, right? So that's basically that for the content review. And okay, we got 2 minutes to go over this. If I go over a bit of time, I'm sorry, but I just want to go through this PackBack question really, really quickly. Cam, I know you have a question. I'm sorry, but we kind of had this huge discussion today, so I'm running a bit behind. I'll stick around after class today for a few minutes if anyone wants to continue the discussion. Okay. So I saw this question. I thought it was really well organized. First thing we notice is it's relatively organized into paragraphs. We can see the student starts off with a great topic sentence: sex verification, sex testing occurs, yada, yada, yada. So we know exactly what this paragraph and this PackBack comment is going to be about, which most sports are. They talk about different ways of testing for this, and then they give examples, right? So they not only give a great topic sentence that introduces the paragraph, lets us know what it's going to be about, they give wonderful quick couple examples to really highlight that, yes, this is in fact what I'm talking about, and here's some examples to show you that I've actually thought about this a little bit, right? So a lot of PackBack discussions that won't get the same grade won't have good examples and good, you know, peppered into their paragraph, right? So you can see the students actually thinking about this. And then they give a more specific example, and they talk about Dute Chan here, and they go on and they talk about socioeconomic factors that lead to this, and just give us a very good description of a more specific example. So you can tell that the person who wrote this really put some effort and time into this. If this is your PackBack question, congratulations. I try not to include the name, so if this is yours, congratulations. I thought it was impressive. And then at the end, they sum up. So they ask a couple more questions that really prompts the reader to start thinking differently about this topic. So really the key things to remember for this week's PackBack review. Next week, we're going to go into even more detail, but our discussion, as I mentioned, was so long that we got a bit sidetracked in a good way. But really to think the key thing is a great topic sentence. Their answer is organized into a few paragraphs. The answer actually has a bulk to it. Like, it's not just one quick couple sentences and then thrown in, but this person's actually spent a bit of time writing this and thinking about this. And then they ask some thought-provoking questions at the end. And finally, they follow up with a source here. Now, it's not an academic source. It's a New York Times source. We'll talk about the difference between academic sources and non-academic sources later. But that's basically why I think this was a good answer. So here were the questions I wanted to ask today. We unfortunately didn't get to them today, but we managed to have great discussions about sex and gender anyway that I think were relevant for this. So I'm going to stop the recording, stop my screen share. Where is this?